Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 35 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Minnesota Wild, in which the Sharks have won 5-2. So this is a game that comes off of a couple of very embarrassing ones against the Calgary Flames, even more so the fact that they were at home. The Sharks lost 5-2, 7-3, just awful performances. And as such, this game against the Minnesota Wild was their final chance to try and get some good feelings and some good vibes around the team going into the Christmas break, where the Sharks will have multiple days off. And it was going to be a pretty tall task. In the Sharks' last few games against playoff caliber opponents, obviously they hadn't gone well, and the Wild are indeed a playoff caliber team. And on top of that, the Wild were coming in with a pretty significant win streak going into this game. So the Sharks, it was going to be a tough challenge, and yet they managed to rise up to that challenge, and which is even more impressive since this is also another game in which Tomas Hertl misses due to his 2-game suspension suffered in that game against the Calgary Flames a couple of days ago. Now this one starts off quite well for San Jose. They get the first goal of this game from Erik Karlsson very early on, but the Wild quickly tied up with a goal from Eriksson Ek, and it is 1-1, and the Minnesota Wild are controlling the game. But the major turning point, not only of this first period, but of this game as a whole, occurs when the Wild are given a 5-on-3 power play. Now, some credit does indeed have to go to the Sharks penalty killers, but I also think the Wild just played this 5-on-3 horrifically, and as such did not manage to score a single goal, which really seemed to be a big momentum booster for the San Jose Sharks, because from that point onward, they were the better team for the rest of that first period, and would even manage to get a goal for themselves, a second goal for themselves from Noah Gregor, his second of the year, and the Sharks would lead 2-1 going into the second period, and the second period would be more of the same for San Jose, but also contain a bit of controversial plays, a couple of controversial plays. The first one is a Mason Shaw knee-on-knee hit. He tries to go for a normal hit onto Evgeny Svechnikov. He looks as though he's going to end up missing that one, and instead of just sort of taking that miss for himself, he instead sticks out his knee and ends up in a knee-on-knee collision with Svechnikov. Is assessed a 5-minute major power play. It is reviewed briefly, but then kept standing as expected because it was an extremely dangerous hit, and as such, Mason Shaw is given a game misconduct. Now, luckily for San Jose, Svechnikov would end up returning, so there is not any injury to that, unlike Mason Shaw, who could not end up returning to this game. But what really makes this more sort of controversial is that earlier on this season, in the Sharks' prior meeting against the Minnesota Wild, it was exactly Mason Shaw who delivered the elbow to the jaw of Radim Simek, which did in fact injure the defenseman for San Jose for a decently long period of time, and no supplemental discipline was assessed to Mason Shaw. Now in this case, it is very likely that some supplemental discipline will indeed be in the cards for him, but this is now 2 straight games where this single player has gone out and not technically injured, because as I said, Svechnikov was okay, but came very close to injuring 2 San Jose Sharks players. So it'll certainly be a very interesting third meeting if Mason Shaw is indeed in the lineup on that night. Now, on this ensuing 5-minute major power play, the Sharks would get a goal from Timo Meier very early on, and then also just as it would expire, Lindblom would score another, and as such, suddenly the Sharks would turn a 2-1 lead into a 4-1 lead. But in the dying seconds of the second period, it would be Zuccarello scoring for the Minnesota Wild to bring this game back to within 2. And what makes this the second controversial play of this second period is that this goal is only scored because Reimer is taken completely out of the play by a falling Wild forward Matt Boldy, who in real time the referee deemed Mario Ferraro having pushed him into James Reimer, and as such it being the Sharks' fault and the reason why this goal ends up standing. Now this goal does not actually end up getting reviewed or getting challenged by San Jose, but from me looking at the replay, I really felt as though this was a goal that definitely could have, at the very least, of course it is a subjective situation, but it could have at the very least come back and been reversed. Now at first I was saying, well, why wouldn't David Quinn take this risk? But the broadcast brought up a very interesting point at the beginning of the third period, that had David Quinn reviewed this play, it would have, and it didn't get reversed, and it ends up standing as a goal, the Sharks would be assessed a delay of game penalty, and as such the Wild would have a 5-on-3 to start the third period. And suddenly if the Wild were to score on that 5-on-3, we're looking at a 4-3-1 goal game, and You never know what could happen after that. And so David Quinn, who may very well have been standing there thinking that this goal should have been goaltender interference, decides to not make the challenge because of the possible risk that it goes the other way, which is just a very awkward situation in general. And it really brings up an odd point of, should there really be a penalty for this type of situation? Now, the first year that challenging was brought into the NHL, there was not a penalty, and teams definitely did challenge a lot more than they do these days, and that seemed to be a problem for the NHL because it was extending game times and things of that nature. But I feel as though if not reviewing is sort of like a strategy to not put yourself in an unlucky situation, even though if you think that the goal should be called back, it kind of defeats the purpose of the challenge. Like on the offside, I can understand, because offside is usually very, very objective, unless it's like within like a millimeter and you're sort of making a judgment call. But at that point, I don't really care which way it goes because it's just sort of there. But every single goaltender interference call is pretty much subjective. You kind of just have to like say in every particular moment. There's no precedent set or anything of that nature. So I feel as though there shouldn't be a penalty for that. You could keep the penalty for the offside, but it feels like a very odd type of rule, in that this would have definitely been challenged by David Quinn had the Sharks not been in a situation where it would have resulted in a 5-on-3, in my opinion. Anyhow, the third period comes along, and while the Wild definitely do control the pace of the third period, it's not that much of a surprise considering the Sharks are the leading team. They go into the classic turtling mode, and it does a very decent job at that. Reimer is solid, and the Sharks would retain the lead and even get an empty net goal, a very impressive empty net goal at that, from Kevin Labanc to make it a 5-2 victory. Now to the players to talk about, we of course had the top line of Meier, Couture, and Barabanov. These three players were put together at the end of the Calgary Flames game, and as long as Hertl is still suspended, they were actually kept together to continue loading up on this first line, and I thought this first line was very, very good for San Jose. We rarely get to see the combination of Meier and Couture. Usually Meier is pretty much stapled to Tomas Hertl ever since like much of last year, but here we are. Much of last year, I believe the last time we saw them was maybe when it was Meier, Couture, and Dahlin at the beginning of last season, but usually it has been Meier and Hertl. But here we are again with these three players together. Meier was superb. I thought Couture was very, very good. Barabanov maybe the weakest link on this line, but still quite the solid game for himself. So just strong game from the first line, but we knew that this first line would probably do some really good things, and really what this first line was leading to as a sacrifice was the second line of Labanc, Bonino, and Nieto. This is a second line that on paper looks extremely unimpressive and downright bad for an NHL second line, but honestly, these three players were not too bad here tonight, I must say. I thought Labanc had a really solid game, which was in stark contrast to his invisible game in the previous one against the Calgary Flames. I thought Nieto was pretty decent, not amazing. And I do want to talk a bit about Bonino, because he also ended up finding himself on the top power play unit for the San Jose Sharks. He continues to fall upwards, and now I should say that he didn't actually do all that poorly in this position. I was expecting a lot worse, and I thought as though he definitely did an admirable job on that top power play unit, but it's still just such a situation where I'm thinking, like, has there ever really been a player in San Jose Sharks history has been treated with such sort of silver gloves as Nick Bonino has? I look forward to the day where he is either traded at this upcoming trade deadline or just not re-signed in the offseason, so that the Sharks stop having this type of player in the lineup. That might sound very mean, but it's just, it has become tiring to watch Nick Bonino. But, even saying that, honestly, it wasn't even that bad of a game. It's just sort of a tangent I wanted to go on. When it comes to the third line of Gregor, Sturm, and Svechnikov, obviously credit has to go to Gregor, who did manage to score a goal in this game. But otherwise, this third line was maybe the weakest line for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. Nothing super impressive there. I think Sturm was okay. Svechnikov did get that knee-on-knee hit, which drew the 5-minute power play, which, did help San Jose win, but not really, to Svechnikov's credit at all. And so generally it was a decent game for the third line, but not great. On the fourth line, on the other hand, I thought it was a pretty solid game for them. Continues to be very strong. I thought Lorentz was once again the best player on this fourth line. No surprise there. Lindblom didn't do a ton in this game, but the one goal that he did score was rather impressive, so I'll give him that at the very least. And Gadjevich was just sort of there, but at least the fourth line wasn't terrible, which is nice to see. On to the defense. We, of course, had Megna returning to the lineup here tonight. The healthy scratch ended up being Radim Shemek, which I don't hate because Shemek was terrible in that previous game against the Calgary Flames. So Megna comes back in. I thought he had a very good game, but obviously the real star of the show was his partner here tonight, Erik Karlsson. I talked about in that 7-3 loss to the Calgary Flames that was Karlsson's one of his worst games of the entire season. He was okay offensively in that game, but he was just downright awful defensively. Here tonight, he truly tried to make up for that, and make up for that he did. A 4-point night for Erik Karlsson, contributes on every single one of these goals besides the Kevin Labanc empty netter, which was unassisted. And this wasn't a contributor in that he got like a random secondary assist or one of the goals that was scored. He just sort of happened to touch the puck right before. This was a situation where he obviously scores the first goal of this game, but then on the other 3 goals, he is the primary reason for why these goals were scored. A very nice shot that creates a rebound for Noah Gregor on this second goal. A nice solid pass, not amazing, but a solid pass to Timo Meier, which gets him that power play goal. And then an extremely nice pass to Oskar Lindblom that gets him that goal that makes it 4-1. And then, of course, the goal, like I mentioned himself. So a 4-point night for Erik Karlsson, his third 4-point night of the season. That puts him up to 46 points on the year in 35 games. I think that is like something like 6th or 7th in the NHL. Now, obviously, he's not going to catch like a Connor McDavid, who sits atop there with 65 points. Just absolutely absurd. But still leads defense by a pretty wide margin and continues his quest to try and get a James Norris for himself, which honestly would not have even seemed likely at all or even possible if you had told me this, let's say, in this past off season. So an extremely impressive game for Karlsson. I also do want to mention the second pairing here, Vlasic and Benning. Definitely a nice little rebound game for themselves. They had been really bad for much of the past few games, so it's good to see here going into this Christmas break that they had that rebound performance and tried to get back to how they were in that sort of middle part of the season, games like 10 to 25 or something along those lines. And then finally, I will mention the goaltender here, James Reimer, a very solid game for himself. The Eriksson Ek one was a breakaway, so not too much of a chance. And the Zuccarello one, obviously, he has absolutely zero chance to make the save on because he is run into by Matt Boldy. And otherwise, he makes a lot of good saves early on in the first period, besides the Eriksson Ek goal when the Sharks were struggling, as well as in the third period when the Sharks were just sort of playing in their own zone a lot. Reimer kept them in, so a nice game for himself. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action all the way on Tuesday. They're going to get a nice break here with Christmas, probably 3 guaranteed days off and then like a practice game. So we'll see exactly how the Sharks will do when they return. It was definitely nice to see them get a win here at the very least. Class dismissed.